Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking at this really fascinating idea that the video games we play aren't always just, fun and games.
Right. They might actually have persuasive elements baked in,
Exactly. And we're basing our exploration on some excerpts from it's a fictional podcast script.
called Propaganda Pixels, How Games Are Weaponizing Your Brain. Bit of a dramatic title.
Ah, yeah, definitely catches the attention. But look, we're not endorsing any specific viewpoints from this fictional show, okay?
No, absolutely not. Our goal here is just to pull out the key insights, the interesting ideas it presents about how games could potentially shape our thinking.
To see what kind of arguments they make, really.
Precisely. And, this fictional podcast, it does raise some pretty interesting points about how interactive media like games can subtly influence us.
So, by looking at their examples, their arguments, we can maybe get a clearer picture for ourselves.
Yeah, of how these persuasive elements might actually work in practice.
Okay, so where do they start? The fictional hosts, I mean. They look back at some historical examples first.
They do. Games with maybe more obvious persuasive aims.
Right, and one of the first they mention is America's Army. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah. Came out back in 2002. Developed by the U.S. military itself.
So, that seems like a pretty clear-cut case, doesn't it? A game designed at least partly for recruitment.
It certainly is a
Yeah.
very direct link between a game and a specific persuasive goal.
It's not really hiding it.
Not at all. And what's interesting, or what the script points out, is how it framed military service. Not just duty, but like a game.
Skill, teamwork, that sort of thing.
Exactly. So it kind of subtly introduces potential recruits to military life, but in this engaging game-like way.
Okay, so that's one end of the spectrum, quite explicit, but then the fictional podcast pivots, right, to something different.
Yeah, they bring up papers, please.
Okay, very different game. You're a border inspector in this, bleak authoritarian state.
Right. And it's pretty obviously a commentary, a critique of that kind of system.
But the question they raise from that is, well, could other games be doing similar things, promoting viewpoints, but maybe more subtly?
Exactly. Without being so, overt about it.
That's where it gets trickier, I guess.
It is. Because while papers pleases direct, maybe other games weave in ideas through, like their story or the mechanics.
Or just what the game rewards you for doing.
Yeah, the values it seems to encourage within the gameplay itself.
Okay, and they actually take on a big one here, a classic, civilization.
Right. Most of it's just like, build an empire, outsmart the opponents. Fun strategy.
But this fictional podcast suggests that core loop, build an empire, crush rivals. Maybe that's sort of glorifying expansionism.
And potentially echoing historical colonialism even.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That definitely makes you pause and think about it differently.
It's a thought-provoking angle, for sure. Because game mechanics, even ones that seem neutral, they can reflect or, reinforce certain ways of seeing the world.
That constant drive for progress, expansion, competition, it is in a lot of strategy games.
It is. And it's worth considering what that framing implies,
The script notes how that core reward loop of just taking more territory, it maybe simplifies or even romanticizes how nations actually grew.
Yeah, potentially normalizing aggressive strategies in the player's mind, perhaps without them even realizing it.
And it gets even more unexpected. They bring up the McDonald's game.
Oh, right. The one that was meant to be educational, about running the business.
Yeah. But the fictional hosts argue or suggest it could be seen as actually promoting the exploitation of rainforests, for profit.
Okay, that's quite a take on an educational game.
It really makes you wonder about the messages, the underlying stuff we might just absorb while playing.
Well, the interesting thing there, if you take that critical view, is how it sort of normalizes potentially harmful practices.
Gamifies them even.
Exactly. Under that banner of education, it subtly suggests that, maybe environmental damage is just part of doing business successfully.
So even games trying to be educational or just fun can have these layers.
Precisely. It shows why it's maybe important to look beyond just the surface story, right? Consider the context, the mechanics, the potential implications.
Okay, so we've talked about how the content or themes might be persuasive intentionally or not. But then the fictional podcast gets into something more direct psychological tactics.
Yeah, they call them brain hacks,
Uh,
how games might leverage psychology.
Let's start with one they mention, the sunk cost fallacy.
Ah, yes. The classic.
They use the example of grinding for loot boxes. You've already put in so much time.
That you feel you have to keep going.
Right.
To justify the effort you already spent.
Even if the chance of getting something good is tiny.
Exactly. That time and effort create the psychological pressure. And games, with their progression systems, their reward structures, they're really good at tapping into that.
It's hard to walk away when you feel invested.
Very hard. Then there are variable rewards.
Like slot machines.
Yeah, they draw that exact parallel. The unpredictability, loot boxes again, or things in games like Fortnite. You never know what you'll get.
And that uncertainty is part of the appeal.
It is. That unpredictability actually triggers dopamine in the brain. It creates this reinforcement loop. Keep pulling the lever, keep opening the box.
Because maybe this time.
Right. And it's super effective at keeping players engaged. Gambling, video games, they both use this a lot. And tied into sunk costs is also, loss aversion. We hate feeling like we've wasted something.
That makes sense. They also brought up cosmetic items, like in Genshin Impact, stuff that just changes how you look.
But people spend real money on them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fictional hosts connect this back to those dopamine hits again, influencing spending.
Well, there's the desire for, personalization, expressing yourself. But getting that cool new skin, it feels good.
You see that little buzz.
And then there's the social angle, too, right? Showing off rare items to other players. That reinforces the spending.
Okay, what about flow states?
Getting completely absorbed, that in-the-zone feeling.
Like when you're playing Candy Crush and suddenly it's an hour later. That just one more level thing.
Exactly that. Flow is characterized by deep focus, enjoyment, the challenge matching your skill. It feels great.
It's not inherently bad then.
No, not at all. But that just one more level loop can be a really effective way for games to keep you playing, maybe even past when you intended to stop.
Kind of bypassing your conscious decision to quit.
Potentially, yeah. Then they get into social engineering.
Like in Among Us.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
It's all about deception, trust, suspicion.
Figuring out who's lying, who to vote out.
It taps right into our social instincts, but in this very specific game-created environment. It shows how games can manipulate trust and competition.
Fascinating how it sets up its own little social rules.
It really is.
Mm.
And the last brain hack they mention is maybe a bit different. They use spec ops, the line.
Oh, that game. It messes with you, doesn't it?
It really does. It questions your agency as a player.
Yeah.
Makes you confront horrible things you do, following orders within the game's narrative.
Yeah, it makes you think about why we just do what the game tells us to, especially in those kinds of military shooters.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of a game deliberately subverting expectations to make you think critically about your role and responsibility, even in a virtual space.
Okay, so moving on from those sort of psychological mechanisms, the fictional podcast then looks at some specific games as case studies.
Right, digging into particular examples. First up is a huge one, Call of Duty.
Can't get much bigger. But it does get criticized sometimes, right, for potentially glorifying militarism.
It does face that criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And the fictional hosts point out the Pentagon's involvement or consultation in its production at times.
Which raises questions, naturally.
About potential influence, yeah.
Yeah.
How warfare and the military are portrayed. It's worth considering the perspectives that might shape the content.
Then they contrast that with something completely different, Disco Elysium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An RPG, but really focused on dialogue and, well, ideology.
Your character has these internal debates, right? Different parts of your personality
Listen,
arguing.
It directly engages with your characters and maybe by extension, your political and philosophical beliefs. It sort of forces you to confront them.
So that sounds like a very explicit way a game can make you think about your own biases.
Very explicit. It's known for that intricate dialogue and how it handles those complex themes, encouraging reflection.
They even talk about Minecraft, which seems surprising.
Well, yeah, most people see it as just this wholesome, creative sandbox. Build anything you want.
But the angle they take is about community creations, mods.
Right. The fictional podcast points out that because it's so open, people can add things. And they mention the possibility of, like, fake news boards being modded in.
So introducing persuasive or maybe even misleading content into this otherwise innocent space.
That's the potential downside they highlight. The openness is amazing for creativity, but it also means user-generated content could have its own agendas, some perhaps harmful.
Interesting. But they do offer counterpoint, right? A game used for something positive.
Yes, they bring up Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice.
Which deals with mental health, psychosis.
Correct. And they frame it as maybe propaganda for empathy, using the game to build understanding.
So showing how game mechanics and narrative can be used to foster compassion, not just sell an idea or product.
Exactly. It's a really compelling example of games tackling sensitive topics with nuance. trying to give players insight into a difficult experience, demonstrates that positive potential.
Okay, now the fictional podcast apparently included some hypothetical listener questions too, just for fun.
Yeah, a couple of quick, playful ones. One was, is Pokemon Go a surveillance tool?
Huh. Because players are basically mapping the world for Niantic, the developer.
That's the observation, yeah. It's
Yeah.
humorous, but it does touch on real questions about location data, privacy.
What happens to all that data we generate playing those games? A slightly unsettling thought behind the fun.
It is. The other question was even sillier.
What was it?
Is Tetris a Soviet psyop?
Tetris. How?
The joke was that the perfectly fitting blocks, eliminating lines, it's like a metaphor for communism in puzzle form.
Okay, that's definitely tongue-in-cheek.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it just illustrates how, people can find or project meanings onto almost anything, even simple games.
The human tendency to find patterns, maybe.
Or just have a bit of fun with interpretations.
Right. So, given all this potential for persuasion, subtle or not, what do they suggest we do? How do we engage critically? They offer some strategies for fighting back, so to speak.
They do. First, they really emphasize just developing critical thinking skills, being able to spot logical fallacies.
Like the example, buy the skin to be cool. That's just bandwagon appeal, right?
Exactly. Recognizing those kinds of manipulative tactics, whether in games or ads for games, helps you make more informed choices.
Makes sense. What else?
Transparency. They stress wanting more openness about partnerships and funding in the industry.
Like knowing the U.S. Army is involved in esports leagues, for instance.
Yeah, just understanding who might be behind the game, who might have funded it, helps you assess potential biases or agendas.
Being aware of the context.
Right. And they also encourage supporting independent developers.
Why indie devs specifically?
Because they often offer different perspectives, challenge mainstream ideas. They cite examples like This War of Mine.
Which shows war from a civilian perspective, very different from most shooters.
Exactly. Or Return of the Obra Dinn, which gets into complex ethics. Supporting indies means supporting a wider range of voices and ideas in gaming.
Finding those alternative viewpoints.
Yeah. And finally, they give some advice for parents.
Ah, okay. What's the recommendation there?
Basically, talk to your kids, discuss in-game advertising, discuss the hidden costs of free-to-play games, not just money, but maybe time or data.
Fostering media literacy from a young age?
Precisely. Helping kids understand the techniques being used so they can make more conscious choices.
Okay. So wrapping this all up then, this deep dive into the fictional propaganda pixel script, it really seems to underscore one main takeaway.
Which is?
That games can be really influential, maybe more than we realize sometimes.
Yeah, and it's just important to be mindful of that potential impact on how we think, how we see the world.
It's not about being paranoid, maybe, but just aware.
Exactly. Approaching games with curiosity, being willing to question the assumptions baked into them. It just leads to a richer understanding.
Both of the games themselves and maybe their influence on us.
Absolutely.
It really pushes you to think about games as, well, more than just simple entertainment. They can be art, definitely. Tools sometimes. And maybe, metaphorically, even weapons in some context.
It's a complex medium.
It is. So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is just to engage critically next time you play. Consider the games you enjoy. What messages, subtle or overt, might they be sending? What are you taking away besides